All right, good morning. So today is Thursday, and we are going to be looking at the World War II home front. So kind of how things were going in the United States during this conflict. Right, so some of the problems at home and how people here in the United States helped the war effort. So, the agency established during World War II to coordinate the production of military supplies by the U.S. industries is known as the War Productions Board. War Production Board. A government system mandated in times of war or crisis which limits the amount of scarce resources citizens may purchase to a fixed amount in a given time is known as rationing. Rationing. An image, typically propaganda, of a strong woman hard at work in the arms factory during World War II. That is Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter. R-I-V-E-T-E-R. Rosie the Riveter. Program which recruited more than 120,000 Mexican migrant farm workers to work U.S. farms during the war due to labor shortages is the Bracero program. B-R-A-C-E-R-O. Bracero program. And when more than 110,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up and were temporarily imprisoned from 1942 to 1945, that is Japanese American internment. Japanese American internment. I-N-T-E-R-N-M-E-N-T. Okay, so one American's story. So this is from a woman named Margaret Hooper. So during World War II, Margaret took a job as an incoming inspector at an aircraft plant. She often described her work in her letters to her friends serving with the Pacific Fleet. Gosh, we've been working hard at work lately. Just rushed to death and never getting through. Our production schedule has been doubled, and we still work harder to put out more all the time. You better be careful how you talk to me, because I've developed a big muscle in my right arm and a strong one in my left arm, so take it easy, kid. Americans on the home front worked together to help achieve an Allied victory, as you will read in this section. So women are going to play a much larger role in production and manufacturing than they did previously, even in World War I. So the fact that this woman's like, got a pretty big muscle in my right arm and a pretty good one in my left arm too, shows that she's working hard. She's building that muscle and using a wrench to torque rivets into place and that kind of stuff. Alright, so wartime production during World War II. Allied forces needed tanks, planes, ammo, etc. to defeat the Axis powers. Okay, so I don't know if you guys recall, all the way back last semester when we were talking about the American Revolution, we made a list of things that armies need. And that list has only grown since this time period. There are obviously some things that we don't need anymore. Right? We're not really using horses anymore because we're using trucks. But those trucks require gasoline. Those trucks require spare parts. Those trucks require mechanics. Those trucks require drivers. So really, we have seen the scale of production that is needed for American industry to support this war has increased considerably. So the U.S. government created the War Production Board to manage the production of these goods. So by 1945, the U.S. had built around 300,000 aircraft and 75,000 ships. 300,000 aircraft and 75,000 ships. So these aircraft are going to be everything from small fighters up to massive bombers, and ships are going to be everything from small Higgins boats and which were landing craft that we saw with the D-Day invasion, if you watch those videos, all the way up to massive battleships and cruisers and aircraft carriers. So, 75,000 ships. And the U.S. had made about 60% of all Allied ammunition. 60% of all Allied ammunition. So all the bullets and artillery shells that are being fired from American, British, French, and Russian machines of war, 60% of them are produced in U.S. factories. Okay, so through that Lend-Lease Act, there's still a lot of sharing that happens there. Okay. Okay. So World War II had created jobs, so the nation's unemployment rate fell drastically. And this is the reason why we essentially get out of the Great Depression. Right? So essentially World War II had ended the Great Depression. So the massive problem that the U.S. was facing during the Great Depression was very, very high numbers of unemployment and very little government investment in the economy. But with this conflict, we see massive government investment in the economy because they are buying all of these weapons and planes and ships that are being produced in factories, and that is very, very good for the economy, and they're providing jobs. Okay, so not only jobs for people that are working in those factories, but also jobs for soldiers that are going abroad and fighting. So it does a lot to bring us out of the Great Depression. The nation's GNP, which is gross national product, meaning total national product, rose to new heights. So the GNP is the total value of all goods and services that are produced by a nation during a year. So we see our GNP grow considerably during this time period. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's well over a 100% increase. Okay, so this is massive growth. Between 1939 and 1945, the U.S. GNP soared from about $90.5 billion to $212 billion. $90.5 billion to $212 billion in products that the U.S. is producing. So that is huge. So what does this say about American output? Okay, we are doing our part. Right, the United States is a world power from a production standpoint and from a military standpoint. Okay, so the fact that the United States joins in this war effort on the side of the Allies really shows that the Allies had this massive superpower that was coming in to help out with this conflict. Sorry, I feel like I have to sneeze, but I don't know. That's going to surprise me at some point. So because the military needed so many materials, some items for Americans became scarce. Some items for Americans became scarce. So items such as gasoline, tires, shoes, meat, and sugar were in very, very short supply. I know if I can find them. So because of this, to divide the scarce goods among its citizens, the U.S. government developed a system of rationing, such as ration cards for gas, for sugar, and I actually have some of my grandma's ration cards somewhere. They're from the Korean War, but they essentially get these stamps that say you take this to the grocery store and you get your ration of eggs or sugar for the week. Okay, and then that's all you get. So this rationing is going to be a major part of American life at this time because you have to change the way that you buy things. Okay, and if that sounds familiar, it probably should, because there's some elements of rationing that many families are having to do during this time period right now. Okay, whether that's rationing toilet paper, whether that's rationing money that you have to go out and do things, right? Because you've got to make sure that you get those bills paid before you can have that extra money to do stuff with. So rationing is going to be a major part of this. To help out on the home front, Americans did their part and pitched in. So just like in World War I, they bought war bonds from the U.S. government. And this is going to account for billions of dollars worth of money that is lent to the federal government to help pay for the war. And they will use propaganda images. Again, we'll see images like Uncle Sam being used for this. We'll see images like Rosie the Riveter, who we're going to talk about. And we also see the image, and the one image that actually raises more money than any other propaganda images was the flag raising at Iwo Jima. Right? So we talked about that yesterday with the war in the Pacific. So for the war bonds at the end of the war, that image becomes the major selling point, because it heralds in this idea that we are winning, that we are going to be triumphant over the Japanese, and these soldiers raising this flag at Iwo Jima have shown that. Okay, so that image is going to be very, very powerful as a propaganda piece. Kids also went around and collected scrap metal, just again as they did in World War I. So collecting scrap metal that can then be used for producing ships, producing artillery, that kind of stuff is going to be very, very important. And again, people once again grew victory gardens in their backyards or on rooftops of buildings. And just like in World War I, this food is going to be used to be sent to bases to train soldiers, and also so that you didn't have to go to grocery stores, right? Because you're able to grow your own food. And we asked this question in World War I as well. Why do you think we haven't had to put this kind of effort in on the home front for a war since World War II? The main reason is the budget. Right? So because the federal government has such a massive budget for defense, the federal government doesn't need to gather more money from the taxpayers, because they're already taking a whole bunch of our money to pay for the expansion of our military and providing for everything that our military needs. All right. So this is read and analyze the material on 75 and 76 to answer the following questions on minorities. We're going to go through this together. Okay. So by 1945, roughly what percentage of the American workforce were women? 30%. So 30% of the American workforce were women by the end of the war, which is pretty considerable when you think about pre-war numbers are probably about 5 to 10%. Okay. So we see much more female involvement in production. And the iconic piece of propaganda for female workers during World War II was a woman named Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter. Now, I'm sure all of you guys have seen that image before, right? So the Yes We Can thing with like the riveter, and I think I put a picture of that in the files as well if you're not familiar with it, but that's an iconic piece of propaganda that shows up there. But women are also going to play other roles as well. So one instance of this are the WASPs, the Women Air Service Pilots, and I've actually got a really, really awesome video that I posted on the WASPs that'll be in the files. And their job was to shuttle planes from factories to the front, right? So they are flying B-29s from production centers in California and flying them to Hawaii and then flying them to Iwo Jima, right? That is their job, is to fly those planes, and it's a pretty dangerous job if you really think about it, because many of these planes were pretty well untested when they went out. So these WASP pilots are the first ones to go up, but because they were still civilians, they initially did not get military sort of hazard pay for what they were doing. That has recently been changed, so Congress changed that and honored those WASP pilots that are still remaining in the 70s, I think. So definitely watch that video about the WASPs, because they are a pretty cool element of American history there that is often forgotten. Okay, so as more job opportunities also became available for African Americans during World War II, what trends still continued from the 19-teens and 1920s? That is the Great Migration. So if we remember the Great Migration, this is the movement of people from the rural South that are escaping the racial prejudices, the Ku Klux Klan, and coming to the North where they are more free. Okay, it's not saying that they are completely free, it's not saying that there is no racism, but it is better than the situations in the South. So what resulted sometimes due to the inflow of African Americans in northern cities? Racial tensions. Okay, we start seeing racial tensions that start developing here. So there are several race riots that are going to occur in the 1940s with people that are afraid of people that are different than them, is essentially what that breaks down to. But blacks are going to play a major part both in that production element and also actively fighting. So probably the most famous group of black soldiers during World War II are the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen. So if you will recall, Booker T. Washington establishes the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama to help train and give black men in the South skills to help produce things and to gain equality through that. one of those instances is going to be the Tuskegee Airmen. So they were trained to fly at the Tuskegee Institute and finally got the opportunity to get a deployment. So I've got another video about the Tuskegee Airmen that you guys can check out with the Red Tails, as they were known. All right, what did Philip A. Randolph help accomplish? This was equal workplace rights for blacks. So Philip Randolph is going to really kind of lobby to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and try to pass some reforms that allowed for equal pay and equal benefits for blacks that were working to their white counterparts. So this is a huge step forward. It's really one of the kind of landmark civil rights things that FDR does during his presidency, which is pretty cool. Also, some 46,000 who left their reservation to work in the nation's war industries are Native Americans. So Native Americans are going to play a part in this as well. We talked at some point, I don't know exactly when, about the Code Talkers, right? The Navajo Code Talkers and the role that they play, specifically in the Pacific Theater, that important role. But Native Americans are also going to play an important role at home in helping aid in this massive production to keep this American war machine going. How did the U.S. fix the shortage of farm workers? Well, we imported Mexicans. We imported Mexicans. And this is a bit ironic because if you recall, during the Great Depression, we deported 200,000 Mexican Americans back to Mexico, 100,000 of which were American citizens. But now all of a sudden, whenever the white workforce goes off and starts fighting in a war, the United States is like, hey, you guys want to come back? You can get your old jobs back, working on plantations and working in orchards, right? So it's very ironic that the United States opens up immigration back to Mexico after deporting so many 10 years prior. So it's kind of crazy that this happens. The Zoot Suit riots from Los Angeles. So a zoot suit was a highly fashionable form of dress, and I've got a couple of pictures of these, so definitely check those out. But these were suits that had baggy pants. They typically had a pretty high waist, kind of above your belly button. You had these loose-fitting coats with super wide lapels. Typically had a long chain that was attached to them for either a pocket watch or for a wallet. And these zoot suits became very, very high fashion, especially in Southern California and among Hispanic populations. They also wore broad-brimmed hats, knee-length jackets, baggy pants. And the reason they're called the Zoot Suit riots is because there's a lot of racial discrimination that's happening. And zoot suits were something that was commonly worn by Mexican Americans in the American Southwest. And so these Mexican Americans were often attacked by white Americans. That they were that they shouldn't be here, that they need to go back to Mexico, that sort of thing. And we're going to see several hundred deaths during the 1940s that are associated with these Zoot Suit riots in places like San Diego and Los Angeles, a little bit in Las Vegas as well. But eventually, the Zoot Suit becomes a more popular fashion that is going to make its way into the mainstream. And throughout the 1950s, we see quite a bit of these zoot suits being common fashion in on the West Coast. Okay, regardless of what race you were, this became fashion. So, what did the African American and Hispanic Americans experience have in common during the World War II era? Discrimination. I think it can be summed up in one word, right? So even though there are some opportunities that are being presented to them, there's still a very, very high level of discrimination that these minority groups are going to be facing, okay, which is definitely not ideal. But the discrimination that they faced was not as bad as the discrimination that Japanese Americans faced. Okay, so in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, anger towards Japanese Americans grew. Now, we know that there is pretty solid evidence to show that Japan had spies that were in Pearl Harbor. Okay, they used suitcases, and they would have cameras in those suitcases so that they could walk around and look like tourists, and then click a button and take a picture. So they knew where the battleships were going to be stationed, where the carriers were stationed, where the fuel sources were, because they had spies that had came around and taken pictures of every single square inch of Pearl Harbor. Okay, it was very, very effective. Okay, and they blended in because there's a high number of Japanese Americans that are living on the Hawaiian Islands. Okay, the same thing is true for the west coast of the United States. So Oregon, Washington, and California are going to see very, very high levels of Japanese American immigration. And whenever it surfaced that the Japanese had used spies to orchestrate the attacks of Pearl Harbor, Americans were very upset about this, and we're going to see a lot of racial hatred towards Japanese Americans. Okay. So many saw Asian immigrants as a threat to their lives, and others believed that they could never truly fit into American society. So the distinction between Japanese and Chinese or Filipino really was not something that most Americans were concerned with. You were Asian, so therefore you were going to be discriminated against, because if you're Asian, you're clearly Japanese. Okay. So with that in mind, many Asian Americans are going to face this discrimination, okay? And it's going to be incredibly problematic. The reason they didn't feel that they could fit into American society is because these groups tended to stick to their own, right? So having ethnic neighborhoods, ethnic groups that they hung around with, that made people believe that, hey, if you're going to spend your time hanging out with other Japanese people, you're not spending your time assimilating into American society, which is not true, right? We are a melting pot, okay? And the cohesion of all of that together is what makes us Americans. So in reaction, Congress banned practically all immigration from Asia in 1942. So in 1942, Congress says, you know what? No more immigrants from Asia. Okay, similar to the Chinese Exclusion Act that we talked about earlier this semester. They're cutting off all of the immigration. So the hysteria created after Pearl Harbor pushed the idea that Japanese Americans were a security threat. Okay, the issue was that they believed they could be spies for Japan, that they were all planning attacks on San Francisco, on Seattle, that they were helping the Japanese government to be able to launch an attack on the mainland, which really wasn't something that Japan was super interested in at the time. But this prejudice that had been established that all Japanese Americans are obviously spies is going to lead to Congress taking some pretty drastic steps. So FDR signed an executive order, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, that allowed for the removal of Japanese and Japanese Americans from the Pacific coast. Okay? Now, the rationale that was given by FDR was that this was for the protection of the Japanese Americans. And there is some pretty good evidence to support that, right? There had been quite a bit of violence toward Japanese Americans. There had been vandalism to Japanese-owned businesses and homes, so there was definitely a threat that was looming there. But why punish the Japanese Americans and make them move and not punish the people that are perpetrating these crimes? Okay, that's the question we have to look at here, right? Is why didn't the United States go after the people that were conducting these hate crimes, as opposed to being like, all right, let's protect the people that these hate crimes are against? Okay, so they rounded up the Japanese Americans, about 110,000 of them, and rounded them up and placed them in internment camps all over the American West. Most of them are going to be in Utah and Nevada, because these are vast open spaces that are very isolated, where they're not going to have to worry about contact from white Americans. Does this sound familiar? Right? So that's the reason why Hitler put their concentration camps in Poland, because they weren't going to be coming in contact with Germans. Right? So it's very, very similar in that regard. But these Japanese Americans had to sell their homes and possessions and leave their lives behind for 3 years, from 1942 to 1945. And those that aren't able to sell their homes and businesses, when they returned in 1945, they're going to find that their businesses, their homes, have been taken over by other people, right? They've been seized, okay, in a sense. So their lives have been completely destroyed by this. Now, Japanese internment is considerably different than the Holocaust for several reasons. One, they're actually going to be provided food, okay? So they're going to be given food. Two, they're not going to be split up from their families, right? So this tight family unit that we as Americans have, the nuclear family as it's known, is not going to be divided. So in the internment camps, you're going to have mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, great-grandparents in some cases, that are going to be there together, okay? And I think this is incredibly important because it allows them to keep their culture, it allows them to keep these units together, and it allows them to endure kind of what they were going through much, much easier because they have that support network. So unlike what was happening in Nazi Germany, where those families were separated and they didn't have that support structure, with Japanese internment, we keep the family units together, and that is important for the sanity of the people that are in internment. They're going to have some freedoms that are going to be given to them within the internment camps. We actually have stories that come out of every morning they would raise an American flag. Right? The actual interned people would raise an American flag, showing their loyalty to the country. And baseball actually becomes incredibly popular in these camps. So there's kind of a large outdoor area that's sort of like a park. So we see Japanese Americans that are getting involved in playing baseball. And after the war, we see more and more Japanese Americans that are going to start making their way through college ranks and into the major leagues because of Japanese internment and the fact that they're exposed to baseball, and that's basically all they can do for the entire time that they are interned here. So that is an interesting outcome in the realm of sport that comes out of Japanese internment. So, this last question that I've asked you guys, would this kind of internment be allowed today? Why or why not? I really want you to think about that question, okay? Because in our current political climate, there is a lot of rhetoric that is based around hate, okay? So, really kind of break this idea down, okay? Would internment like this be able to happen today, and does it happen today? Okay, so do some research if you want into kind of what's going on in our country, and do you think that this is still an important issue? Okay. All right, so I'll leave you guys with that thought today. Make sure you check out those videos that I suggested. So the WASP video, the Tuskegee video. There's also some videos on Japanese internment. So check those out and supplement your learning today. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of